now we're on to our next pair of papers, which will be addressing uses of things in a wide range of historical practices. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker of this pair, Catherine Whalen, who is an assistant professor here at the Berns Graduate Center.
There we go. I'd like to echo the thanks that have been given. I'm really delighted to be here and grateful to the organizers and everyone else who was part of making this happen. So my presentation, Collecting as Historical Practice, that was my mandate. And I've gone through a lot of iterations of this project, and this is where I am at the moment. And I'm interested in thinking about this problem of the unmoored object, is what I'm calling it. And my presentation is divided into two parts. The first is general musings, and the second part is brief descriptions of my case studies. That's how I'm also going to organize the essay as well. So my starting point for the essay was the premise that collecting drives scholarship, a well-established dynamic in material culture studies in general. And my initial goal was to demonstrate this mutually constitutive relationship through case studies that positioned Americana collectors as foraying into the construction of history and as creating the foundation for U.S. material culture studies once their collections became institutionalized in museums and academia and codified in publications. So collectors produced and underwrote much of the first scholarship on Americana in concert with or doubling as curators, dealers, and independent scholars. And I'm especially thinking here of the early to mid 20th century, when examples of early American fine and decorative arts flowed into museums and educational institutions at a great rate and unprecedented speed, a process that resulted from and contributed to their ascendant cultural and economic value. But this imperative was driving me towards institutional history, which is not actually where I wanted to go. And I'd rather more closely consider the imbrication of people and objects at the heart of material culture studies. And I use the word heart very deliberately to stress the affective dimensions of this dynamic. So my animating questions are, how do individual subjects remake both objects and history through their own desires? And how do aggregations of artifacts inspire historical narratives and the reverse? So I have turned to collectors and the way they articulate the interconnections they make between material things and immaterial values. Examining their practices can be very fruitful as they often express those interrelationships, whether through complementary or contradictory modes, such as they may be material, they may be visual, textual, or performative. And especially useful are those instances where they are obliged to make their meanings legible to a larger audience in order to garner attention for their material rhetoric. And that's, for example, if they want to give their collection to a museum, would be a case in which this occurs. And in order to do so, they have to embed their explanations in relevant cultural discourses. And these might include political ideology, philanthropy, education, preservation, self-expression, personal memory, or some combination thereof. And their goals for their audience's transformations may encompass the cultivation of taste, aesthetic refinement, emotional sustenance, spiritual elevation, moral regeneration, social and political activism, and learning and historical consciousness. I mean, there's like any endless number, right, of motivations that they're trying, of actions that they're trying to spur. So while this latter issue of learning and historical consciousness is my mandate, I'm not going to exclude the others. So for my case studies, I sought out collectors who wanted explicitly to construct history with material culture, even if they don't use that term during the early part of the century. And what I found is that despite their faith in the power of objects to embody that history, they were wary of the object's polysemy or their wildness, to paraphrase design historian Judy Atfield. And this is the inversion, right, of the Cohen-Hoven, right? Things are the things that are slippery, not words. So words, for them, were essential to fix their intended meanings to objects and tether them to their desired historical narratives. And to paraphrase Americana collector Francis Garvin, who gave his collection to Yale in the 1930s, it was absolutely vital to obtain an object's documentary record. And here he disavowed his earlier belief that, quote, the piece itself recited its own history, unquote. So the collectors that I'm interested in are not those that became academics or curators, I really want to look at the outliers, or what Henry described, I think, as in-betweeners. These are the people that are kind of operating in trying to have a foot sort of in both camps, so to speak. And that would be the so-called antiquarian or amateur historian, and amateur in the sense of the lover of. But these individuals, if they wanted to take part in the dance of words now being performed by professional historians, they had to learn the steps. And I'm thinking here of the much discussed influence of the German historical school upon standards of scholarship at this time. And so if sanctioned historical evidence meant primary sources in the form of written documents to be wrestled into printed prose, these collectors were in a pickle. How could their stuff become the stuff of American history? So really troublesome were the unmoored objects, long since detached from points of origin, existing in space and time, in a sense their histories being superseded by their actual physical presence in the here and now. I think a lot of us have talked about this issue. So for the collector as a would-be historian, the absence of known narratives prompted assiduous document-based research, and they grappled with their subject's muteness, despite that metaphorical conceit of objects speaking or telling stories or capable of being read. And so thus they're seeking out genealogical records, provenance, wills, probate inventories, letters, account books, and the like, a lot of the sources that we've also talked about using. So these textual sources were a key strategy for tethering the unmoored objects to some kind of historical narrative. But along with the holy grail of the documentary trail, certain characteristics of artifacts or modes of engagement with them were especially attractive. And first, and in some ways maybe the most obvious, were inscribed artifacts, which artifacts with words on them, text literally married to an object. There were also strategies of space and place, so situating objects among larger constellations of artifacts. And you think about archaeology, but for these practitioners, a lot of times that meant period rooms or historic houses, right? And there's a lot of unspoken efficacy in these kinds of spatial dispositions, such as actual or imagined bodily engagement with objects as prompts for social performance. There's a lot of unsaid, right, mileage that you can get out of it. And if that's a situation where you don't have all the artifacts that you want, you can do substitutions and replicas because it's the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The attention isn't so much in the individual object in the case, right? And then finally, what I came to in thinking about this was actually figural representation, and especially linked to the genre of biography. And here portraiture is really important, and particularly I would say sculpture. And really it's the personification of history through the figure, right, through the individual, through the biography. And so attaching individuals to object does more than just provide means of dating a location, it fires historical imagination, right? Now, this, of course, makes it a target of scholarly critique then and now, even with the rehabilitation of biography through practices of microhistory. Yet, then and now, these biographies provide a really powerful means of mooring these unmoored artifacts. And so that's the kind of collector that I'm specifically looking at here. So let me go on to my case study, the first one. Actually, I'm going to, oops, sorry, wrong one. I'm actually going to, yeah. So I'm going to talk about where I started from and where I may be going to, but I got interested in the Luke Vincent and Alice G.B. Lockwood. Luke Vincent Lockwood is the creator of the period rooms at the Brooklyn Museum that many of you know of, and he's lionized for one of the first books on American colonial furniture, published in 1901. And the reason I think he's particularly interesting, besides the fact that he hasn't really been explored much, is that he was really interested in objects that had documentary records, right? Not so much the masterpiece. And he and his wife, you can see, you can see here there's this pewter basin up at the top. I'm not really doing a very good job. It's not really, thank you. Yeah, up there on that table. It's not really critical, but for example, he and his wife are giving objects both to the Met and to Brooklyn, but the things they're giving to Brooklyn are things that are, first of all, American objects and going into these period rooms to sort of supplement them, and they're giving their sort of their fancier European objects to the Met. But, you know, as I was looking at them, I realized Alice actually is, in some ways, more of the collector. She's the person who inherits the stuff, right? She has a family connection to it. And she's also a scholar in her own right. She writes about lace, which is not a particularly highly regarded area of study in material cultures like her husband, but nonetheless a very interesting one, and one I think that is coming around, actually. But her big claim to fame is this book, Gardens of Colony and State. And she publishes this in 1931, and it was just republished in 2000. And it is a 900-page book of every possible print and documentary source you can imagine about early American gardens. And so with the resurgence of interest in garden scholarship, it's become a much referred to and revered text. And what's interesting about them is that I think there's this parallel world of male collectors and women gardeners at this time period, and but they do also overlap. There's ones, you're not just relegated to one camp dependent on gender, but then nonetheless there's a gendered practice there. And I want to explore that more, and especially about the notion of gardens being ephemeral, right? So here again, this is question. This is something that no longer exists, right? But here are these sources that can help you recapture it. And that's something that she's interested in doing. And then, I know it's hard not to laugh. I'm going to try to play this straight, though. The subject of my second case study is this man, Doris Dudley Seymour, who single-handedly really made the nation what he called conscious of Nathan Hale. And that's this Revolutionary War martyr who was hanged in 1775. And quickly I'll say about Seymour is that he's born in 1859, he dies in 1945. He grows up in central Connecticut. He's a patent lawyer. He's very attentive to description and particularity, but he also has a really, really passionate historical imagination and interest in family history and Connecticut history. And also, a real out-and-out just fixation on Hale. So what you see on the right there is this house that he bought as the birthplace of Hale in 1914, and which it turns out wasn't. And it was actually built the year that Hale died. Okay, and so he writes to his friend, this is Horace Taft, the brother of the president, about this and about his, he's crestfallen, and Taft writes back, I read with great interest your struggle against the truth of history. And this is his constant struggle. He doesn't have the artifacts and the things that he wants to make his history authentic. Okay, but on the other hand, he doesn't really care about authenticity. This is an interesting thing about him. So there's a plaque now by the house that explains that, okay, it's not really where he was born, but it's on the same site, so it's okay. Here's some of the interiors that he outfits.
Hard to find that plaque.
Yeah, it's you gotta turn the leaves there. Okay. He actually he's a founding member of the Connecticut Antiquarian and Landmark Society, and Antiquarian is a title that he very much assumed. He has a collection of Connecticut furniture. It's a lot of family pieces, some of which are taken from, I'm going to go ahead, this house, which is torn down, but he commemorates in his own bookplate. He collects Connecticut furniture, and then he makes contemporary pieces where he can inscribe his own initials and date and his own insignia, okay, which he also makes up. You see that here on a piece of silver. And you can see like the winged hourglass, right? Time flies. Very, very conscious about time. And also the fixation on doorways, right, as a portal from past to present. Very much something he's interested in. He peppers the Connecticut countryside with these memorials to his ancestors, right? And if you think about it, they're like gravestone-like, and the whole fixation on gravestones in American material culture studies, they actually have all these elements I've been talking about. Inscribed text, right? They have iconography, right? They're permanent, they're fixed, right? They don't move, right? And they have biography attached to them. So I'll try to go really quickly. Here's his, right? In the Grove Cemetery in New Haven. He also commissioned a series of portraits. This one is he's trying out an identity as a connoisseur, which he later rejects because he's really interested in history, not aesthetics. But he notes there how this portrait makes him look taller than he really is. So he's an inveterate scrapbooker and clipper, and he's always telling you that the inadequacies. He's always using text to explain the inadequacies of the visual representations. Here's another one where he's imagining himself as this, latter-day English gentleman, dandy. These are dandy person. And then this last one he settles on is himself as an antiquarian, painted by Cecilia Beau. And here he's wearing this cloak that he says he got out of this 18th century garret. He wanted there to be a whole lot of much more deliberate references in this portrait, the family chest, the picture of the Nathan Hill homestead. Cecilia Beau didn't want to do any of that. And she also didn't really want to paint him in the cloak. And it turns out she probably was right because he's embarrassed by this portrait. He says it makes him look like a dilettante. And there's a whole also issue of appropriate masculinity. He's doing dress up, right? And it's 1925. Well, he was a little.
This is cloak making look sad.
But anyway, his big claim to fame is getting the statue of Nathan Hale on the Yale campus. Again, there's no actual likeness of Hale, right? Has to make it up, okay? So he engages the sculptor Whalen Pratt, who comes up with this clay model. Seymour claims he's found this silhouette portrait of Hale at the birthplace, except the birthplace wasn't the birthplace. He gets him on a postage stamp, and in part he's arguing that he's a perfect Nordic type, so he's borrowing the language of eugenics, right, in order to get this national, this is 1926. But at the same time, I really think Hale is a double for this great love of his life, Henry Solon Graves, who was the dean of the Yale Forestry School, and they spent a lot of time together up at the homestead. Graves is married, but nonetheless, they have a very close relationship. Seymour describes himself as a lifelong bachelor. And then I wanted to end by talking about the two histories he writes about Nathan Hale. And this is the first one. It's a digressive history about Nathan Hale and his best friend, John Palgrave Willis. And you can see him here, he's very self-conscious. He knows this is a digressive history. He knows it's antiquarian, okay? But he still wants to do it anyway. And a fraction of the book is about Hale because there's not much information about it. Most of it's about Willis. He has tankards made in their honor. And then, of course, the Hale statue has a long life, including being outside the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, now called the George Bush Center for Intelligence. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that. But again, what he does in the end is he publishes a documentary history. And this is used. This is actually something that anybody who studies Nathan Hale turns to first. Right? This anthology of documents. So I'm out of time, so I'll leave it there. But I could talk about my other case studies now.
Okay, so now we're going to turn to Marla Berns, who is the director of the Figural Museum at the University of California in Los Angeles.
I'd like to also thank Sarah and Ivan and the sponsors and everyone else. It's been a great 2 days and I've learned a lot. And I wanted to share some of my own research and also a subject that's been of interest to me for a very long time. And when Ivan asked if I would participate in this project, it seemed it was another opportunity for me to look at women's body arts in the context of material culture and memory. And I'm showing you 2 images. I could show you more, and I will. But for many of Africa's diverse peoples, the permanent modification of human skin was, and rarely still is, a fundamental strategy for embodying memory. The anthropologist Dominique Zahan describes scarification and other forms of body alteration as the tegumentary language of non-Western peoples. He also said, as have others, that the skin is likely to be the first canvas of humanity, a threshold between self and others that implies interaction and exchange. Terence Turner, another anthropologist, has explained further that the surface of the body is the frontier of the social self and a symbolic stage on which socialization is enacted. Bodily adornment is literally one language of its expression. These examples show us the malleability of the skin surface and how African cultures have incised and sculpted it to create patterns of communicative meaning. Most dramatic are those, as you see on the left, that were cut and rubbed with various substances to act as irritants so that the scars would actually stand out in sharp relief against the otherwise smoothness of the skin surface. These programs of scarification, like this one practiced by the southeastern Nuba of the Sudan, obviously change the body permanently. Their designs communicate a variety of messages about identity, relating to ethnicity, kinship, social status, gender, and physiological change. All of these changes, of course, are paid for in pain, as you can imagine. Most can be said to perfect the person with what have been called marks of civilization. From the evidence we have today and the field research that has been done, it is primarily the bodies of women that bear the most elaborate systems of signs that map memory in skin. Early photographs taken by European explorers and colonial officers in the late 19th century are often all we know about practices of inscribing highly specific patterns of scarification on the bodies of women. And you see this in this particular example from the tabwa of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the memory of the marks that would have been worked on the back of a woman are carved into the sculptures of ancestors. And you can see that the memory of these marks is maintained through their transference to materials of greater endurance than the human form. The same can be said for the Luba, also of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and both Mary Nutter Roberts and Alan Roberts call the Luba body an inscribed surface of events. When these memorial landscapes move to sculpture, as you can see in this slide, the spiritual efficacy of these sculptures is activated by referring to the shared systems of meanings with the inscriptions of designs into the surfaces of skin. Henry Druel, and we saw this image yesterday, has written about scarification for the Yoruba of southwestern Nigeria and neighboring Benin, and the fact that they carry and convey ontological concepts about personhood and the unitary idea of body is mind. And I present them because they show yet another method of altering the skin surface by introducing pigment into the cuts that are made into the skin. And it's important to make the point that there is beauty in these practices as well as purpose in terms of why they're being done. And lest we forget that there is an aesthetic impulse that's involved in scarification. I did my field research in northeastern Nigeria, which is a world away from the Yoruba, who are down here. It's an area that has extremely rugged terrain. It's very thinly populated. Urbanization happened late. It protected the cultures who lived there very much from the onslaught of encounters with outsiders, even though the area was missionized from the 1950s. And there's both an Islamic and Christian presence in these communities. They still maintain their traditions to the point in time when I did my field research, which was in the early 1980s. And what I'm showing you is a series of slides that show you the bodies of women who I photographed in the field and the diagramming of these programs of scarification, which has been a method of kind of retaining them and mapping them on the body, which you can see is like a canvas. And I'm sorry that the slides, it may be difficult for you to see the actual markings on the skin, but they're there. And the striking thing is that the three groups I worked with all did these very specific and very elaborate forms of body scarification. They were always done in a series of stages, beginning when a young girl was about 8 or 9 years old, before she was pubescent, and it occurred in a series of stages so that marks were left on their own before they became a part of the aggregate. So in fact, in this instance, the individual unit is often as important as the aggregation of designs. And it was interesting to see that the designs were actually consistent from one woman to another within each particular ethnic group. And it's important to note that the completion of the scarification program in all these cases was a requirement of marriage and signified the permanent transition of a young woman to adulthood and to the intended social responsibilities of that changed status. And in this particular image, I'm sorry you can't see it. It was hard enough to see it in person as it is to photograph it, but this young woman only has completed the penultimate stage of scarification because it had been outlawed in 1978. The local government said, no more scarification. This is much too barbaric, we won't have it. And so it was actually being done up until 1978. The elderly women who do the scarifying use a small iron hook to lift the skin, and then they make very tiny cuts in the topmost level of the skin, and the scars heal into these very tiny bumps that create a richness of texture and pattern, and very different from those large raised scars that you saw earlier in another example from the DRC. And it's important to note that these marks actually fade and become nearly imperceptible as a woman ages. But on the other hand, the newly formed scars are quite apparent just at the moment of this transition of a young girl to marriageability. And there's also the point that I think was also made yesterday, that there's a kind of eroticism to the transformation of a woman's skin. It is both pleasing to her as well as to the person who touches her. So it's a kind of stimulant to sexual intimacy right at the moment when you want it to happen. The other point that became very clear to me as I looked at especially the material culture and the visual universe of the Ganda people with whom I spent the longest time, that women's bodies were clearly likened to containers of all kinds. And that was very clear in the actual transformation of the exteriors, of the skins of, say, a vessel with the very same patterns that you'd find on a woman's skin. And you can see the circular forms on the vessel and these lozenge shapes that are one of the most dominant patterns in the scarification program. The same is true of the gourd bowls that women decorate to serve their husbands food, where the lines of scarification actually follow the curvature of the gourd, as in the curvature of a vessel, as in the curvature of a woman's body. And even further, granaries, which hold the foodstuffs of the year for the full year until the next harvest. This is a man's granary, a man's granary that's also decorated with those same circular and lozenge-shaped forms, again, referring to a woman's body. And you can see that the scarification program is a template for marking other objects within the Ganda's total visual universe with these emblems of enculturation. And then even further, these are ancestor vessels that the Ganda make, and these are the places that ancestral spirits go before they actually get broken and the spirits get sent to the other world. And they too are intentionally scarified with the very same patterns that you see on a woman's body on the vessel. It doesn't mean that they're female, but it means that they're enculturated. As I said, that means that marking translates just the basic pot into the proper container for the ancestral spirit. And then even beyond that, and I think in the most compelling example of all, the Ganda people create this bearer of history and memory. This is their spirit deity called Ngumgumi. And Ngumgumi is conceived as actually a perambulating vessel that led the Ganda people from their prior location to where they now live. And so in order to provide a place for this immaterial force, they create a material form. And in addition to male tools and weapons that are always a part of the iconographic system of these vessels, the main element of decoration is the scarifying of the skin and the creation of that same textural difference, so that what Ganda women symbolize in terms of social perpetuation, Ingungumi as the founding hero represents for Ganda historicity and continuity. And I would just show you again the relationship between the marks on the skin and the marks on the pot. And in fact, the skin is lifted and then cut in almost the very same way as you would lift the human skin and cut it. And in addition to that, I found it rather remarkable that in these systems of inscription, that there is a similarity, whether it's the skin or the surface of a vessel, the surface of a gored cuticle that's broken. All of these kinds of decorations represent controlled, regular, repetitious, and meticulous ways of making line and inscribing meaning. And the act of doing may be as much a part of the memory making as the meanings that may be invested in the designs themselves. So I would just end by saying that for me there's little doubt that the fundamental inscription of meaning onto the surface of the skin has provided a kind of template for the creation of a total design system. And whether or not this is due to some deep structure that may now be inaccessible to us, it's clear to me that the alteration of a woman's body has created a language of history, identity, and collective remembrance. And it has moved from the actual ephemerality of the body to the skins of other more enduring things. And so now, with scarification prohibited, these material things, whether they're pots or architecture or gourds, become the final bearers of culture and meaning and memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Marla. Thank you, Catherine. We have some time for some questions. Yes, Laura.
Sort of great papers, both of them. I'll ask one about the women in your photographs. The first photographs, they were unclothed.
Yes.
And then you have the bra. And the relationship between that, the attitudes toward the woman's body that developed and how they may or may not have led to the forbidding of the scarification. So modesty, is it health, is it power?
I think that the young woman was uncomfortable, clearly. I've never published that photograph. I don't often show it because I really wanted to document the scarification. I wanted to see the marks, and it was a difficult thing to do, to say, do you mind taking off your clothes so that I can look and so I can document this. And so what you were also seeing is not just the prohibition against the scarification, because before you had the presence of the missionaries and other people who were introducing clothing, women would not have worn clothing. Mm-hmm. This would have been a place where your body presented itself in all of its scarified splendor, if you will. But I think that bras came in, but women wore them as clothing. They didn't realize that they were undergarments. They were garments, and they became kind of modesty.
The first ones with the raised, were those, who made those photographs?
Those photographs were early colonial photographs.
Yeah.
They were turn of the century archival photographs.
To document lack of civilization, or I mean, I'm just interested in the viewpoint, the changing viewpoints on this practice.
I think when these practices were documented at the turn of the 20th century, they were seen as barbaric. Although some of the photographs are quite beautiful, so you think that perhaps that wasn't just the only way that they were looked upon. And I think that the local government authorities became convinced by missionaries and others that people should stop doing this, that there was something barbaric about forcing women to have their skins cut now. So I think there are, I mean, I don't see it as violence against women. You know, I see it as a cultural practice that had deep resonance, and I think it becomes so in our reading of it, you know, now.
Marla, I was interested in the relationship between the pots and the bodies that you drew out. A very compelling visual relationship. But can you say something more about the social relationship in terms of who did all women get scarified? Were there differences in terms of class and status? And then, and likewise, the pots. Can you give us something about their social function? Do they parallel? Does ownership of the pot and use of the pot reflect the social structures akin to the distinction of who gets scarred and how?
As far as I could tell, every single woman was scarified. Every young girl equally went through the process, and the status division would have been the division between everyone and the families of, or the lineages that were held responsible for maintaining those those pottery shrines. I couldn't say much about them, but those shrines should have been covered. They should have had a house over them. They should have been secret from view, which is why I mentioned that thing before about secrecy. But as they were mostly no longer being tended as they should have been, they were exposed, and women would have never seen those pots.
Oh, yeah.
So women would never knew that their bodies were represented on the highest spirit in the land that was protecting them.
I remember Polly's work on the Luba. She was talking about the role of women in the kingship. So is there any parallel or totally different?
Well, I think that because it's a kingship situation, it's a different one. But I can't make the same argument, but clearly the power of women's bodies are present on everything, and therefore their power is pervasive. And that's why I argue that you can't, just because a man is the only one that can touch the pot, doesn't mean that men are the only ones who are powerful. That women are powerful by virtue of the presence of their skin.
So, two-part question for you, Marla, because those images really are striking. And so you alluded briefly in the middle of that there's an aesthetic function, presentation, and it has to do with marriage and that moment in a woman's life. But I guess, so part one, could you just elaborate further on what's the memory being inscribed? I didn't get a sense, unless I missed it, what's being remembered.
I think
what's being, yeah.
I think Gondaness is being remembered, and that sense of identification with a people, with a place, with an ancestry, with a heritage, with a long lineage of people who've come before you.
Okay.
I think that the marks, the shapes, also have meanings, and some of those meanings have been lost to us. But I think that they don't add up to a language, but I think they are, some of the markings have names that refer to cultural objects like knife handles or gourd pieces, etc. So I think it's a kind of mapping of what makes the Ganda, not like the Yungur who live just below, south of them.
Okay. So my second part, you know, this question of question about gender here. For me, at any rate, one way to address this question of whether this constitutes a kind of, as you say, violence against women is to ask, all women get it. Do any women get to say no? I don't want this done to my skin.
Well, I don't know. There may have been over time someone who said no. I can tell you that there's a spiritual side to this. There's the idea that the elderly woman that makes the marks sees the designs presented to her from the spirits who give her the vision of how to do it, and that's how they say that the designs are replicated. And there are young girls, of course, where the designs get badly irritated and go bad and get septic, and you end up with a mass of keloidal tissue that is a disfigurement, and that's said to be because you did something that has punished you.
Which is, in this case, being a woman and having to go through a scarification process.
Wasn't enough, right?
Well, that seems to have been the, yeah.
Denise?
Thanks so much for both papers. A question for Catherine. This may seem like a very basic question, but I wanted to ask about writing about collectors and how you reconcile writing about what the collector thinks he's doing with what you think he or she is doing. I didn't get to present at the end of my paper about a collector of Cultural Revolution things that has built the Smithsonian-like complex in the countryside, and named Fan Chuan, and he says he's not doing history. He says he's just collecting things. That historians later will figure it out. He also won't share with historians. He won't share his shipping containers and warehouses full of stuff. But he says he's not doing history, but when you look at his curatorial practice, he's clearly making very, very strict choices. So I'm wondering, when you think about your antiquarians or collectors, how do you mediate between their strongly constructed self-perception and how you view it?
I guess I have a couple of thoughts about that question. I think it's a really useful question. And I mean, for one thing, the thing about history collecting, a lot of it is in fact biographically based around a collector, and that is frustrating to a lot of people. On the other hand, a lot of the theoretical constructs, that tend to pathologize collecting, so it's also very reductive, right? To apply those in some kind of homogenizing way. So I'm very interested in collections themselves as forms of narrative and material narratives, right? That somehow express something through their constitution. But I'm also really interested in what people say about them. So for me, it's really helpful to look at. I think actually, what's great is if with someone like Seymour, you have private, kind of this whole private correspondence, and then you have this public correspondence. I mean, everything he sent to anyone had a label on it of him explaining what his intention was. And so it's very clear that he wanted to, especially with images, he really wanted to control that representation. He even copyrighted that image of Cecilia Beau painted, and he has a type description that he put in the back that he sent to everyone. Okay, so I think in his case, I have a lot of evidence to talk about what I think he thought he was doing. And then I also have moments where my voice is about what I think he's doing. Other collectors are much less self-conscious about, and they don't. He has actually a great deal of
much less helpful.
Well, he's also very self-reflexive, and that's one of the things I find interesting about him is he's aware of the kind of conundrums that he's perpetuating in.
So next we have Rebecca, and then have one more question. So
actually, I didn't seize my time because that was basically my question. I was interested in the laughter that we all experienced.
The what?
The laughter that we all
Oh, yeah.
and how that, basically your question.
Okay, so very quickly, Tom and then Judy.
Suppressed memory. About 10 years ago,
Yeah.
these 3 or 4 of us were in a room discussing your friend, and I remember there was a facilitator. There was a facilitator who said, "Well, isn't this mythology? Isn't myth bad history?" Do you remember that
I
comment?
think I blocked it out.
Here I am, a decade. This is 10 years ago, right?
Oh, yeah. No, this
That was
is
there.
yeah.
This is the memory panel.
Yeah, it's memory. And then it just struck me.
We should have had the capsule with Barry at that time.
Well, I think
We haven't used the word myth very much in the last 24 hours.
Yeah, I think the problem with the term myth is that it's really flattering, and it's like the problem with the term sentimental, right?
Yeah.
It's a thought stopper. Nostalgia is another one. Like if you just say, "Oh, this is nostalgia," then that's the end of the discussion, and it doesn't go anywhere, right? So I think we need to push on it. I mean, it's more than. I mean, I think it's kind of like bad history according to whom, right? I mean,
Remember the times things. I like the word.
Or I mean, it's also. I mean, I think what's interesting to me is how his dilemmas are actually mirror the dilemmas of historians now, right? They're not irrelevant. They're not. We may sort of say, oh, well, he's not trained, he's not this, he's not that, but he's grappling with a lot of the same kinds of issues. So for me, there's a strong kind of self-reflexive component for me in thinking about this.
Okay, so just very quickly.
Yeah, just on this one point, I mean, I can't help but comment that both Neil's title and now the subject of yours brings up the Antiquarian, which is really the doppelganger for history. And I think in terms of the history of studying things, that's really where most of the work was done from the Renaissance to now. And the emic edict of the historian dealing with the Antiquarian is really a crucial problem, I think, in the mix here.